Hello and welcome back to Poppy and Grayco's YouTube channel. I am Poppy and Grayco, but my name is Issa Down. I am a self-taught artist, educator, author, living at the base of the Rocky Mountains. And I created this YouTube channel for people like you who are wanting to jump into watercolor and maybe find it a little bit intimidating, or you're just wanting to learn a little bit more. So today I am going to take you through the 10 tips for any new beginner watercolor artist. I thought about naming it something like the top 10 mistakes that new watercolor artists make, or 10 things you don't know about watercolor, something like that, but it seemed a little too kitschy. So it's really is just 10 tips that I have learned over the years and have compiled together into a list for you today so that we can talk about them and that you have them all then at your fingertips to use as you wish. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the 10 tips. Tip number 1 is to use the right paper. So this first tip, using the right paper. When I first started painting with watercolor, I was using something called Bristol paper, and it's just a really smooth paper, which I had started with because I started with colored pencils, and then I moved on to ink, fine liner pen, and then when I started adding in watercolor, I just kept using the same paper. And while it's great for pencils and for ink and pens, it wasn't as good for watercolor because it wasn't soaking in any of the water. It just kind of got muddy and the watercolor just kind of went everywhere. And then I started realizing that paper does actually matter. So watercolor paper is designed to absorb the water that you're using, because you do need to actually use water with watercolor, right? So it's designed to take in that water and to give you those really cool effects of the watercolor colors melding together, and leaves you with often that really beautiful kind of watercolor texture that we all recognize, right? But there are 2 different types, generally speaking, of watercolor paper, and then there are qualities and weights within that watercolor paper that make them different as well. So we have cold press watercolor and hot press watercolor. Cold press watercolor is generally what I use. All of these examples here are cold press watercolor. I couldn't find my hot press because I never use it, so I have no idea where I put it. I know I have one somewhere. But so cold press watercolor, basically cold press versus hot press is just telling you the process for making the paper. One uses a heat process and one doesn't. So a hot press watercolor paper is not used as often. It has a much smoother surface and it's a little bit less absorbent. But the benefits of it would be that perhaps your colors of your paint will be more vibrant, and they are really good for like really fine detailed paintings. So if you're someone who wants to go in with a tiny brush and do lots of really fine details and you want them to really show on the page, I might suggest that you take a look at some hot press watercolor and see if you like that over cold press. Cold press is that more textured watercolor paper. It's typically the most used, and gives watercolor paper that texture or the tooth that you see on here, which is basically just the bumps on there. Now, depending on the brand and the method of how the paper is made, you're gonna get very different effects. So for instance, my Arches watercolor paper, it's 100% pure cotton and 300 gram, 140 pound paper, is super textured and really absorbs the water. So the hot or cold press is going to absorb a lot more water. So depending on the quality and the thickness of that paper, it's going to change how quickly you need to work with the watercolor to get them to kind of mix together, how quickly it's going to dry, what it's going to look like in the end. Generally, also, it's going to be slightly less vibrant colors on the page because of the way that it's absorbed. But it is also a lot easier to correct mistakes. It's just easier to lift off color or to correct mistakes that you've put on the page. And this kind of paper is generally more stable when wet The hot press is going to buckle a little bit more because of that smoothness, and it's not as absorbent as the cold press paper. So this one is super textured. This Strathmore paper is still textured, but it's not as absorbent. It's still rather absorbent, but not quite as absorbent as the Arches. And then we have this Canson watercolor, which is the cheapest of all of the versions here. And one I just really like to use because I feel like, probably because of the cheapness of it, of the paper, I still get that texture, but it doesn't absorb as quickly. So I have a little more time to work with what's on my paper. And I really like that. And it still takes ink and pencil really well. And it's harder for me to use ink on something like the Arches paper because of the high absorbency of it. So different brands, different methods, whether it's homemade paper or made by a machine or some hybrid of the two, that's going to change the thickness and how absorbent and how bumpy or how much tooth there is on the paper. So keep in mind as you're selecting paper, first of all, absolutely use watercolor paper when you are using watercolors. And second of all, consider what it is that you are trying to achieve on the page. If it's mixed media, if it's only watercolor, if it's high detail, low detail. If I were to live in a really like moist state with lots of humidity, or, you know, yeah, somewhere with a lot of humidity, I would probably use Arches a lot more often because I would want that watercolor to soak in really quickly. I live in a super dry area, so I like that this Canson and even the Strathmore paper, I like that they don't absorb quite as quickly my watercolor and water as the Arches paint does. So all of these things to keep in mind. The biggest thing, of course, experiment and figure out what you like best and what feels the best for you. Tip number 2, use 2 cups of water, 1 for clean and 1 for dirty. This might seem a little extravagant or excessive, and to be honest, I forget 98% of the time to do this, but when I do use this method, I really like it because when I am coming in and painting with a lighter color like my yellows, I want to be able to come in and paint on the page and rinse that off, come in with a dark color and be able to rinse that and then not go directly into my yellow again with this dark paint residual on here, because at some point this isn't going to be clean water, right? It's going to get darker and dirtier, and I don't want to go from a dark, dirty water into my really bright, clean yellow. I want to have control. And so if I use this, and you know, after a while, those of you who've painted know that your water can get pretty gross, and I'm really bad about changing it. So if you change it frequently, maybe you don't need to use 2 cups. But once this gets all brown and icky, I can rinse in there and then come into my clean water and then go into my yellow paint again and bring that onto the page, knowing that I haven't muddied it up with dirty water and it hasn't changed the look on the page of the color. So I can really control that vibrancy. Tip number 3, use tape. But just coming in with some good old masking tape, you can tape down your canvas, especially if you're using like a hot press paper, which we talked about doesn't take the paper as well, or doesn't take the water as well, and maybe becomes a little more buckled when you're using it. Or even my Canson hot press, just because it's a lower quality paper, it doesn't absorb as well. Using tape, I can tape down the corners or the edges of my paper, either to my page or to a painting board if I want to be able to move it around. And that just holds the paper down so that as it's drying, it's going to remain flat. And then depending on what you're going for, you can also have a really nice border along the edge as well of just white paper. And you just make sure that you're doing the same distance from the edge of the paper onto the table on each side so that you get a nice even border. You can see here where the border in there would be. Now, tip number 4, if you remember to use tape, make sure you de-stick your tape. Is that when you are using tape, I don't like to just take it off here and put it directly on the paper like I did here. I find that especially after some time, if I've been letting it dry, you know, maybe I've even been painting for days or hours, whatever it is, the longer this is on here, the harder I have found it to peel off the tape without also peeling off a layer of paper. And that's just the most frustrating thing when you have this beautiful finished piece and then you end up with this torn spot. You can kind of see it on this painting here, where I tore the edge of my painting as I took the tape off. Now, that's totally fine if you're using the painting to, you know, maybe you're scanning it and digitizing it, selling it as prints or using it for something else like that, totally fine. If it's an original, you've been commissioned or you're wanting to then sell, it's just super heartbreaking for when that happens. So my tip for you is to de-stick the tape. Very technical term. I will just take the tape and I will put it on either my pant leg or the table and I just stick it down a few times and that just kind of takes off the harshness of it. It kind of like de-sticks it a little bit and then I can put it down onto the page and I am far less likely to tear anything when I pull it up. Of course, when you're pulling it up too, don't just rip it off. You're gonna kind of very slowly peel it up as you go. That also decreases that risk of ripping the paper. Tip number 5, you're finished with your painting and you realize that you have forgotten to tape and now your finished dried painting is buckling a little bit. That is not a problem. You can spray it with water. Now, tip number 5, if you are like me and you often, frequently, maybe always forget to tape your paper down, and you have finished with your painting and you find that your painting is really buckled. You know, the page hasn't taken it well and maybe when you hold it to the side, it's all wobbly. No problem. Wait until your painting is totally dry. And then I will just flip my painting over to the side that is blank. In this case, I obviously have some sketches on here, but let's say this is the blank side of the paper and I have my fully finished beautiful painting on this side. I flip it over once the other side is totally dry and it's buckled and I just take a spray bottle and I just spritz it once or twice so that it's just barely wet. You don't want to saturate it. You just want it a little bit wet and then I will dry it between like under a heavy book or between 2 books. As long as the bottom surface where my actual painting is clean and dry, then you're good to go. And then when I take it out in a couple hours or a couple days, depending on the humidity of where you live, your paper is perfectly flat. And so I have never really stressed about using tape, but I do find that it can be really helpful. And I imagine that living in a place with a lot more humidity, taping is probably much more important for you than for where I live, where it's just so dry. Everything dries so quickly and it's just not really an issue in the long run for me. So this painting is an excellent example of I did not use any tape when I painted it and it dried really buckled. But now this one is totally dry. So I can come in with my handy spray bottle and I spray the back and not every part of it is sprayed, but it's sprayed enough that I can either just sort of move this around with my hand or with a brush. But essentially, I'm just gonna go pop this under a hard book or a heavy book and with a clean surface on the other side. And when it dries, it's gonna be totally flat and I'll have no problem. Tip number 6, understand the role of water with layering, by which I mean you want to understand whether you want it to be dry between layers or wet between layers or kind of somewhere in between where it's maybe a little bit damp. So let's take a look at that. Right, so if you are wanting more detail, maybe even more vibrancy in the colors of your painting, you're going to want to let the layer below it really dry. That's going to give you this very clean line between the different layers and really add a lot of definition in there. Now you can see here, you still get a little bit of definition of this flower, but it is also still rather blending in with the background. And that's because I put this flower in when it was kind of in that middle zone where it's a little bit damp, not fully dry, but it's not wet. So that allowed a little bit of definition, but also a little bit of that blending in with the colors behind it. And what that did for this painting was add that perspective that there are kind of endless flowers going back. And then you can see here where things just very much blended in with the background, and there's no definition of what is happening in here. That was just me adding color on top of wet color on wet color. So more wet on wet technique here, kind of wet on damp, and then wet on dry here. You can kind of see that in here with this painting as well, where you can see a lot more definition in these shadow lines in here, and that's when I came in wet on dry, because I wanted to make sure I could get a good crisp line there, as opposed to coming in over here where there are multiple layers of paint, but they kind of all blend together, and you don't really get a very strong definition of where the layer is. Including, you know, over here, you can see this background before I came in wet on dry with this thin line here is just looks like one sort of blended piece. And so really understanding your paper and the dryness of it and how the dryness level is going to affect the overall look and feel. If you're wanting to learn more about these specific techniques, particularly this one, my latest Skillshare class, or my one in, gosh, I think it's from the end of May. It's called Exploring Watercolors, and I'll link it for you below and in the video if I can, but definitely below in the caption, takes you through all these different techniques, and we go through practicing different flowers using all these different techniques. So if you want a little bit more in-depth, go check out that class. But otherwise, just know that you need to understand the dampness of your paper, and that goes right along with understanding what paper you're using and using the right paper. Tip number 7, if you're new to watercolor, maybe you come from a different medium like acrylic or oil or something like that, where you're used to painting from dark to light, meaning that you start with your darkest shadows and kind of build up until the very last thing you're adding is your light areas, or where things are reflective. That is not how you do it in watercolor. So tip number 7 is to paint light to dark, meaning from the very beginning, you need to have a good understanding of where the light areas or the reflections of your painting are going to be, because as you add more layers, watercolor, which is translucent, is going to become more and more opaque and therefore darker. Let's take a look. So painting light to dark in watercolor just means that when you put down your initial layer, we're going to use this painting again, when you put down your initial layer, it's rather translucent, meaning I can see underneath and it is not a completely solid color. So I'm painting light to dark. For me in this painting, that meant less definition in the lighter parts behind, but you can also see that means that I've left some areas light from the very beginning, areas where I want light to be able to come through, or where I want the eye to be drawn. And as you add more layers in watercolor, it becomes more and more opaque, which you can see here, till you get to a point like this where it's rather opaque and it's very clear that this is one of the darker parts of the page, including, you know, these highlights in the leaves. So painting from light to dark means understanding what's going to happen as you add those layers. And it's a lot harder to go back in afterwards, especially once your paint has completely dried, to add those light areas later. So if you're painting an eyeball or something like that, it's hard to go in exclusively with watercolor and, for instance, pull up enough paint to make that, you know, like a white reflection in the eye, after you've already let it dry in, you know, the hazel color that you wanted the eye to be. I personally like mixed media, so if I make a mistake, I have no problem coming in with white paint or white gel pen afterwards, you know, like white gouache or something, and adding that highlight in myself. But if you're using exclusively watercolor, you should not be doing that. It is very frowned upon by the powers that be. I don't know who they are, but I've heard it's a really big no-no. to me, I say do you, but yes, you are technically supposed to paint light to dark, and that's primarily just because that's how the paint works. It's more translucent with one layer and becomes more and more opaque or darker as you add more layers. Tip number 8, when you're sketching underneath, if you want to sketch underneath your painting to draw it out first or however that looks, you need to understand the hardness of the lead that you're using because it will give you different effects. Now, understanding the hardness of the pencil you're using to sketch underneath really, to me, just kind of means understanding what you're wanting to do with your painting. So I have a lot of paintings where I've painted and I intentionally want that under painting or under drawing of my pencil sketch to kind of see through the painting, because then for my personal style, I will come in and add some unfinished sketched pencil pieces in it as part of the finished piece. But if you're wanting to paint underneath and not have it show through, then there's a couple things that you need to know. The primary thing being that harder lead is going to be easier to erase. And you don't want it too hard because then it's going to leave potentially lines in your page or indents in your paper. But I think to me, if you use a soft touch on your paper with your sketch, you're going to be okay. My most used pencil for underdrawing is just a regular number 2 pencil, or this HB lead. It's easy to sketch something underneath, right? And just do it really lightly. I'm not leaving any indents in my page. And then if I want to come in and erase it with a molded eraser, I can just kind of lift it up almost a little bit. Or you can just come in and fully erase it. It erases really easily. It lifts up well. So it's kind of that happy medium. But really any kind of harder pencil is going to be better than, say, a sketching pencil or like a really soft graphite. So for instance, this is a really soft pencil, and even going really light, even a lighter touch than this one, it's darker on the page and it's gonna be, I can barely lift it just by doing that. Whereas if I'm lifting here, you can see I lift almost the whole line. And while it does erase, it also kind of smudges and I'm not able to pick up as much as easily as I do with the harder pencil. So just kind of keep that in mind depending on what the look is that you're wanting underneath. If you're wanting to really be able to lift it up before you start painting, but still be able to barely, see the outline of what it is so that you can paint within that, I say go for it. And that's a beautiful way of painting and making sure, especially if you're doing a commission or a really big piece, that you are really seeing what's underneath and being able to practice the layout and figure out exactly what you're doing. But a harder pencil to me at least, an HB pencil or a number 2 is going to be your safest bet. Tip number 9, get a color wheel. So the next tip, of course, is to get a color wheel. Even if you are farther along in your painting journey and you feel like you kind of understand how you like to mix colors. I love this color wheel. It's by the Color Wheel Company of all names. And I just got this on their website, colorwheelco.com. I got it years ago. And the reason I like this is because not only can you see what their contrasting colors are really easily, and that they give you warm and cool tones. These are warm colors, these are the cool colors. So you can kind of get an understanding of what warm colors versus cool colors might look like. But they talk to you about the different values. They show you what happens if you add red to blue violet or red to straight violet, and the colors that you're going to be getting. And you can turn this around and you can really see, like, what if I add black to this blue, but what if I add black to this kind of blue-green color? You can really see what color you're going to be getting, or adding white. If I really want to make a mint color green, that's not quite minty enough for me, but I can see if I add it here, that's getting to that like almost like vintage kind of mint, but I don't want it to be too blue of a green or it's going to just turn into like more of a robin's egg. kind of blue. So I really like that aspect of it. And it's just so full of color, theory and information in a really great visual way. And being able to understand, you know, they have like harmonious color schemes that you can use, complementary, analogous, or monochromatic. They give you this idea of, you know, like what the complementary colors are, what the split complementaries are. It just goes into everything here. And I have just found this to be incredibly useful, especially as you start, you know, maybe wanting to do something more commercial or less for yourself, or, you know, if you're struggling with your colors just getting muddied up together on the page, or not understanding like, why, you know, I used a red and a blue, why does this not look the same as Issa's when she was painting with a red and a blue? And that could very much have to do with what kind of red you're using and what kind of blue you're using. Tip number 10 is paint color swatches, especially when you get new paint. When you get a new set of paints, and this is not a new set of paints for me, but when you do get a new set, or when you are adding a new paint to your palette, try it first. Try it, you know, by itself. What does that look like just on its own? What if I start adding water and I start to dilute it? You know, what are the different shades or the different values that I can get from this one color? You can see, you know, the whole gradient of it here as you're just adding more and more water, and see how pale it can get. And then I also love when people are doing color mixing charts as well, where they take all of their colors and, you know, they add, you can have like red on this side, and you have yellow on this side, and you have red paint here and yellow paint here, and then you add, what happens if I take a little yellow paint and I add 1 drop of red? What color do I get? What happens if I take a little bit of pure red and I add 1 drop of yellow? And then you can paint that and say, then what happens if I add 1 more drop of red? So now it has 2 drops of red in it and 1 more drop of yellow, and so on and so forth. And you get this really beautiful color mixing gradient where you really can understand how these colors really work together. Because of course, how much you add of the other is going to affect it, right? Adding a lot more yellow will make this a lot more of like an orange, like a yellowy orange red, or more of a yellowy orange versus more of a red orange. I am terrible at doing that. I just don't have the patience, but I love people who do, and I love watching people who do. And I think it is so incredibly informative and so wonderful. And if I was wanting to learn more about color mixing, or if I was a more patient person, I would do that. But I'm not very patient, and so I don't do that. But I will try to find a video and link that below of somebody else so that you can take a look at what I mean, because it's a really, really valuable resource to know how to do. And they're just really beautiful and almost meditative to look at. So those are the 10 tips for you today. And then tip number 11 is my little bonus tip. And that is to please, please embrace mistakes. Things that we view as mistakes are actually the things that are teaching us the most. And I find even to this day that giving myself the opportunity to play around, to make mistakes, to do things I'm not used to doing and see how it turns out, not only informs me of what maybe I don't want to do in the future, but it also informs me what I do want to do in the future. And sometimes our mistakes are the things that give us our own little special individual flair in our style, or the thing that we just end up really love to do, or love doing. Because sometimes those mistakes are maybe things that other people warn you not to do in terms of how to paint something, but it could give you a really cool texture or a really cool effect. It could be something that would be like really neat for some shadowy background in a forest, or that could work really well for hair or for a flower petal, whatever it is that you're painting. So make mistakes and enjoy them, because you're gonna learn something either way, either what not to do or what you would like to continue exploring. That's all for today. Make sure if you like this video, you hit subscribe wherever that button is. Like it, comment, let me know what you think, if you have any other suggestions or tips as well that you've learned. And we'll see you next time.